Первое. Октябрь и ноябрь будет молотилкой страшной, которой не было еще, потому что они будут до конца пытаться эти возможности использовать. Второе. Единственный способ это тормознуть у нас, который сейчас остался, это мирный переговор, про который президент и говорит, и к которому мы все идем. Дружненько все идем всем миром. Поэтому мы упустили свой шанс на войне. Поле боя мы не сумели построить вооруженные силы, и мы сейчас находимся в ситуации, когда, если так продолжится, через 3-4 месяца, сейчас фронт валится по 4 направлениям основным. Это Кураховско-Покровская, назовем его так, Торецкая, Часов-Яр, Купянск.
After the capture of Ugledar, Russian troops discovered a stable defense of the armed forces of Ukraine in forest plantations north of the city. However, to the west, on the road to another Ukrainian fortress of Velika Novoselka, there seemed to be no such defense. Some Ukrainian analysts think that because the battle for Pokrovsk is expected to be prolonged, Russian troops have opted for this significant bypass maneuver. Meduza reports that the Russians achieved a breakthrough by capturing the village of Zolota Nyva.
Угледарская наступательная операция продолжается. Буквально через несколько дней после освобождения шахтерского городка российская армия с боем взяла поселок Золотая Нива в 20 километрах западнее Угледара.
Some 15 kilometers west of Ugledar. In the future, it is reported that this threatens Ukraine with a new crisis, this time in the direction of Velika Novoselka. The situation is also difficult for the armed forces of Ukraine to the north of Ugledar. There, the Russian army is advancing in the general direction of Kurakhove from the north and northeast. If the dynamics of the advance continues, by the end of the year, Ukrainian media reports that Ukraine may lose the entire southern Donbas. Further north, in Pokrovsk, as well as in Kupyansk, on the border of Luhansk, there are also advances for the Russians, the more notable of which is in the latter sector where the Russians are approaching the Oskil River. Yuri Fedorenko, commander of the Achilles Battalion of the 92nd Separate Assault Brigade of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, said in an interview with Ukrainian media, the Kupyansk sector is one of the most challenging in near the Kharkiv region, where the Russians are throwing a disproportionate amount of forces. In essence, everywhere is now considered a difficult sector for defending Ukrainians. As setbacks mount and Western support dwindles, bordering NATO countries seem to fear what a Russian victory would mean for them. To Ukraine's west, the bordering nation of Poland has taken steps to significantly increase the spending on defense by several percentage points, now making it the leading European NATO country in terms of expenditure as a percentage of its GDP. The stated reason for this budgetary shift is, of course, the Western narrative of an impending invasion by the Russians. Such a narrative seems contradictory to the narrative of Ukrainian victory that we heard all through 2022 and which President Biden repeated even in 2024. But the worry isn't simply that Ukraine is and will lose this war. The real concern is what this war has done to Russia's military power. So today's video will continue to report on the aftermath of Ugledar's capture by the Russians and the Russian assault toward Velika Novoselka, which seems to have caught the Ukrainian defenders off guard as they moved most of their troops after surrendering Ugledar to the north toward Bohoyavlenka. I will also then touch on the situations in the Pokrovsk direction as well as further north in Kupyansk. So let's get into it. According to Meduza, the problem for the armed forces of Ukraine on the Ugledar front is that the group that defended the city is moving north and the Russian troops seem to have decided to attack in the western direction. The 58th Motorized Infantry Brigade of the Armed Forces of Ukraine is defending there, which over the last month allowed a breakthrough of Russian troops to Ugledar from the west, lost the village of Preshestivka, and more recently, the neighboring village of Zolotaya Nyva. The 72nd Mechanized Brigade, which defended Ugledar directly, is trying to build a defense northwest of the city in order to prevent the breakthrough of Russian troops on Bohoyavlenka and further on to Kurakhove. This, according to Ukrainian media, presents advancing Russian troops with a unique opportunity to attack against the weak defense of Ukrainian defenders on the way to Velika Novoselka, a Ukrainian stronghold on the border of Donetsk and Zaporizhia regions. At the same time, Russian troops continue attacks north of Ugledar from the side of Novomykolaiivka, which they captured in the summer. The Russian forces are advancing on both banks of the Suki-Yali-Antonovka River. In the future, this offensive may lead Russian troops to the rear of the 72nd Brigade north of Novoukrainka. Given that the Russian armed forces are also attacking in the direction of Kurakhove, in the deep rear of the Ugledar group of the Ukrainian armed forces, the situation for Ukrainian troops in southern Donbas after the fall of Ugledar is described as being extremely difficult. On the southeastern section of the Kurakhove front, Russian troops are attempting to expand their control around Vodian and south of Katynivka, making notable advances this week along the northern bank of the reservoir on the Soloda River. As a result, street battles are expected to soon unfold in Katynivka, placing the Ukrainian defense forces in a challenging position as they will be surrounded by two rivers. To counter this, a new defense line will likely need to be established along the Suki-Yali River. However, Ukrainian media reports that the most dangerous situation is developing near Kurakhove. Here, Russian troops are attacking daily through the villages of Maximilianivka and Hostry. Currently, the Russian advance is minimal, but steady on a daily basis. They have already occupied the eastern quarter of Maximilianivka and are close to the village of Ostrovki, which is a mere 1.5 kilometers from Kurakhove. However, Kurakhove is protected from the north by a reservoir on the Vovcha River, which will become an insurmountable obstacle for Russian forces, and therefore they would be forced to pull up their southern flank or break through head-on, which could delay them for months. In Pokrovsk, Russia's notable success in this area has been the occupation of Sukhoriny, a process that took just over 2 weeks. Currently, the front line runs along the railroad in the western quarters of the town. However, Russian troops have managed to cross the railroad and advance toward Izmailivka, which is right to the left of Hernik, beginning to threaten Hernik from the western side. To the north of Sukhoriny, Russian forces are preparing a foothold for an offensive on the southern districts of Selidove, as they have been unable to enter the town from the east for over a month. At the same time, they are also preparing to move on Selidove from the north, but the Russian offensive has slowed down considerably, first in Marinivka and then beyond. The pace of the Ukrainian forces' defense in the Novelsky pocket is also not very encouraging for Russia, according to Ukrainian media, as instead of a rapid collapse of the front, the Ukrainian defense forces have been retreating slowly for several weeks. This week, Ukrainian troops retreated 2.5 kilometers along this section of the front line, only after the final loss of their last positions in occupied Krasnohorivka. Ukrainian soldiers still have over 4 kilometers to go before they are completely out of the pocket and can gain a foothold on the right bank of the Vovcha River near Zoryan. One of the reasons for the seemingly slowing down of the Russian offensive to Pokrovsk could be the destruction of Russia's 3 command and controlled headquarters located at the Avdiivka Railway and concrete plants by Ukrainian missiles and HIMARS. The reports say that the headquarters of the 2nd Combined Arms Army, the 27th Motorized Rifle Divisions, and the 35th Motorized Rifle Brigade were all blown up. Further north, a dangerous situation has been developing for Ukraine, which I have not yet reported on recently. This is on the Luhansk border. Ukrainian media reported that the situation on the border of Luhansk and Kharkiv regions deteriorated even further over the week. Russian troops have now reached the outskirts of Kurakhove and another village located on the bank of the Oskil River. Access to the Oskil is the main goal of the Russian offensive near the city of Kupyansk, which has been going on for more than a year. If Russian troops reach the river, it will complicate the defense of the eastern part of Kupyansk. The Russian air and space forces constantly bomb the crossing across the Oskil and Kupyansk itself, and if the road to the south is cut off, it may complicate the supply of the armed forces of Ukraine. Probably after reaching the river, the Russian forces will try to reach Kupyansk from three sides: the north, the east, and the south. Without pushing the Ukrainian forces to the opposite bank of the river and unblocking the main roads, it is simply impossible for Russian troops to attack south along the Oskil River to Borova and then on to Liman. In summary, the Russians are advancing all across the front line with varying degrees of success. Each of these areas can quickly become critical for Ukraine should any further breakthroughs occur, and thus Ukraine's defenses must remain stretched to try to defend every area all at once. From a broader perspective, it is safe to say that these constant Russian advances do not go unnoticed by Ukraine's NATO neighbors. BBC Russian recently put out an article signaling that Poland has undertaken what I describe as a Herculean task to become the strongest army in Europe. This would require them to move up 3 spaces from being the 5th largest army before the 2022 invasion. The demilitarization of the Ukrainian army, which was formerly ranked number 2, would no doubt assist them in this lofty aim. The reason for this task is, in my opinion, based on a false premise. I quote from the BBC Russian article. Despite Putin's claims that Russia has no interests in Eastern Europe, Poland is seriously afraid that the Russian army may start a war on its territory next. In 2024, Warsaw will spend 4.12% of its GDP on defense and plans to increase it to 5% in 2025, which would make them the biggest spender of European NATO countries as is seen in this chart. According to the Swedish Institute for Peace Studies, this amounts to a 75% increase from 2022. Currently, the Polish army is not more than 200,000 people, but Polish authorities have repeatedly stated their intention to increase this number to upwards of 300,000. But I suspect the real reason for this shift in budgetary expenditure focus has less to do with the inevitable Ukrainian defeat and more to do with what this war has done to Russia's military as a whole. Contrary to the Western narrative of high Russian casualties in East Ukraine, Asia Times assesses the situation quite differently. They report that the alliance suffers from a critical shortage of armaments, an untested and undermanned armed force, and a US presence that is described as being still mostly expeditionary. To the contrary, it reports as follows, as to Russia. Russia has learned a great deal about how to deal with NATO weapons using its air defenses and electronic jamming capabilities. And that, most notably, and I quote, "There is no reason to think that aside from air power, NATO could do any better in Ukraine than the Ukrainians have done themselves." Such an analysis, which I think is reflective of the reality, should bring a sensible Ukrainian regime to the negotiation table with the grim realization that can be phrased simply as this: no one, not even the mighty NATO, can or will save you from the upcoming defeat.